picking bad spouses, staying away from bad spouses. You know, girls that come from bad families. You know, I was worried about that when I was a kid. Man, you going fool with that girl, that, you know, her mama, they are just very anti-Christian. You know, you marry that girl and first thing your kids be like that. You know, this kind of thing.
Okay, now,
Parents should always be concerned of what families they children marry into.
mhm. Now reflecting back on last Sunday's lesson, we know that it was a direct instruction from God that Abraham's son was not to marry a Canaanite woman.
Right.
And we understand why. But even though he went to a far country and he found a woman who God did favor, does anybody remember any of her special qualifications that she had to have? The servant was praying, you know, that they would be so, and while he was praying, remember she approached him. Anybody remember some of those, just one or two of those qualifications that Rebecca had to meet?
She was kind.
Huh?
She was kind.
She had to be
She
kind,
was a worker.
good worker,
She was a virgin.
virgin. hmm Okay, so even though she was not a Canaanite woman, which was really a no-no, because Abraham told his servant, say, even if this woman refuses to come back to this country, I still want my son. He asked Abraham, the servant did, if she don't want to come back here, do you want me to take Abraham to her country? And Abraham said, no way. Under no conditions are you to take Isaac out of this country, because that would interrupt with the covenant that God had made with him. So learning from last Sunday's lesson then, Isaac did get a godly woman, and if I remember right, Isaac was about 40 years old when Rebecca came to him. And now we are turning the clock ahead some 20 plus years, because now Isaac is in his 60s, if I remember correctly. And there's a situation going on which will be revealed in our lesson. But today's lesson is titled Siblings Rivalry. Now, for those who do not have a Sunday school book, go to the 25th chapter of Genesis, and we're going to start at the 19th verse. And if anybody want to borrow my Sunday school book, I can freely lend it for now. L-E-N-D for now. If anybody want to borrow it. Okay? So if you have the 25th chapter of Genesis and you're at the 19th, one thing I want to mention, Sister Evans went to Mardell's. She went to Mardell's yesterday and she bought her own book. And Mardell's, this book normally sells for about $19, and Mardell sold her one for 14 something, wasn't it? Okay, so if anybody's interested, this store is in Edmond. So if anybody would like their own book, I would be more than happy to go by there and pick you one up. And that's the price you can look at or lease, you know, depending on your situation and the guidance of the Holy Spirit. But they are available at Mardell's, and that is a discount price, $14. Okay, now we were turning to the 25th chapter of Genesis, beginning at the 19th verse, and we'd have to like somebody to read the introduction to the lesson, which is given very good in the 19th verse. Matter of fact, read 19 and 20 together, somebody.
And these are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham begat Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah to wife, the daughter of Bethuel, the Syrian of Pan Dan Aram, the sister to Laban the Syrian.
Okay, now in those two opening verses, it tells us that, okay, we're kind of reflecting back. This is the account of Isaac's family. It tells you how Abraham's servant went to Haran and got Isaac's wife, Rebekah, and how Isaac had married her, and said Abraham had lived 35 years or more, and he died at the age of 175, and that was 20 years after Isaac had married Rebekah. Now we're gonna go into something that is not different or unusual, but it's early, it's in the early stages of the generation of God's chosen nation, and that is Rebekah's condition. Now, we've already seen this one time in Sarah, and we know the results of that. So now we're going to see almost a repeat of that condition, and for that we're going to start with verse 21. 21, somebody.
Isaac pleaded with the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was unable to have children. The Lord answered Isaac's prayer, and Rebekah became pregnant with twins.
Okay, verse 21 tells us that after about 15 years of marriage, there had been no additions to the family. And Isaac, realizing that he was to be the extension of that covenant that God had made with Abraham, naturally he was concerned about that. And at the same time, Isaac being a man of God, you know, as a kid growing up, I'm sure Abraham had introduced Isaac to the Lord, had told him the ways of God, and Isaac probably really responded to being a man of God, or maybe at this time we could say a child of God, when his father had taken him up to the mountain to be sacrificed. If we remember that, Isaac didn't rebel, he didn't argue with his father, he was almost like a lamb in just being obedient to his father's instructions. And if I remember correctly, Abraham carried this all the way to binding his son and putting his son on the altar and getting ready with the knife to present him as a sacrifice before God stopped him. So we know from that history that Isaac was very familiar with God and had even experienced some of the works of God. So in verse 21, Isaac entreated the Lord for his wife because she was barren. Now, whenever we see a woman in the Bible and she's preceded by the words barren, we can think of several situations in the Bible where there was a woman who was barren. And real quickly, let's just run through a couple of other situations where there was a woman in the Bible who was barren. She took her problem to the Lord, and talk about the results of that problem. Just started to spin off of verse 21. We know Sarah was, and we know she ended up with Isaac, and now we're talking about Isaac and his wife is barren, so he takes his problems to the Lord. Now we're going to leave Genesis for the time being, and let's look at another situation. Can anybody think of, in the Old Testament, another woman who was barren, took her problem to the Lord, and the results was blessed?
Hannah.
Hannah. Okay, who was the son that God gave Hannah? Samuel. And who did Samuel become?
Yeah, he came a Nazarite, didn't he? Yeah.
Well, a little, as far as something that was functional among the people, title, position, he was one of the last judges of ancient Israel and one of the first prophets. If you remember right, it was Samuel that God sent to find Israel's first king, wasn't it? Okay, so not only was Hannah given a son, but a special servant of God. Is there another woman in the Old Testament we can think about that had a similar situation? Sarah? Okay, we started with Sarah, Abraham's wife.
Rachel.
Who?
Rachel.
Rachel? One of Jacob's, okay.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, and what was the result of that answer from God? How was Rachel answered? I guess you're going to tell us, brother, like Daniel.
You know, Jacob had two wives. And so she was married to two sisters. And she ended up having Joseph and Benjamin. And, you know, he was treated special by his dad, and he ended up saving his people.
Yeah, Joseph was the key son out of those 12, wasn't he? Okay, and I was thinking of another woman who even her time was before, let's say, the one he just mentioned. I think it was before, but I'm gonna give you a clue. Her son became one of the great judges in the book of Judges. Anybody know who I'm talking about? She was barren. Well, I'm not sure she was barren. But anyway, an angel came to her or her husband and told her that she would bear a son.
Elizabeth?
Her son became a judge.
Oh, that's all we just.
Story of Samson. Anybody remember that?
Yeah, we mentioned that one.
You did say Samson?
No, we said
Samson,
his
not
mom.
Samuel, Samson.
Oh, Samson.
Yeah. Okay, so those are just a few examples. Oh, and two in the New Testament. There were two women in the New Testament who were barren. One was barren, and the other, of course, was a teenage virgin. And their sons became who and who?
One
John became the savior of the world.
One the Savior of the world, and the other one was the forerunner of the Savior of the world. So we see God has made a history of taking women who physically could not do the normal thing, but he's proven that with him, all things are possible. Okay, the next verse is verse 22. And now Rebecca is pregnant, and she's several months along because the babies have developed to the point where something is happening. But somebody read verse 22, please.
And the children struggled together within her, and she said, if it be so, why am I thus? And she went to inquire of the Lord.
Okay, notice that both parents, first Isaac inquires of the Lord when there is no children, and now that she is pregnant with twins, and there's something going on that she don't understand, she does the same thing. So here we have a pair of godly parents, both going to the Lord for things that they physically can't handle and do not understand. Any comments on verses, let's say 22 and, 22?
I have one comment when she didn't know what was going on, because at this time she didn't know it was two kids inside of her. So the point I want to make, she went to the right person. She went to the Lord.
Amen.
You know, a lot of times we don't know when we should go to the Lord, but we should be able to trust and have faith in Him. She knew the whole story of her existence and why she was there. She knew the history of Abraham, and God had made a promise that through his seed, you know, it was going to be blessed, and so she knew all that. But she didn't know what was going on at this time inside her. She didn't ask her husband, anybody else. She went straight for the Lord.
Amen. At first she was barren. Her husband goes to the Lord. Now she's pregnant twice. She's having twins, and she goes to the Lord. Anybody else want to comment on that?
Well, I know in verse 21, it says Isaac went to the Lord first in behalf of his wife. And I think it's always good for a man to pray for his wife.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Amen. And Perry, when we first opened the lesson today, you were talking about, you know, how when you was growing up or something like that, I don't mean to take it personal, but there were certain girls from other families, you know.
Yeah.
Well, I was just wondering at the time, you know, when you were saying that, if the parents of those girls in other families, you know, had been like the parents today in the lesson, would that girl, you know, have been better, or if the boy would have been better? I think everything is better when a family knows the Lord and prays together. And you know, as adults today, as grandparents today, some of us great-grandparents today, we can still take our situations to the Lord, even though it's not our child, it's our grandchild or our great-grandchild. We see that child going astray, God is still in the correction business, isn't he?
Yeah.
Just because we're not right there in the same house with them does not stop us from taking it to the Lord. Verse 23, someone.
And the Lord said unto her, 2 nations are in thy womb, and 2 manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels. And the one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger.
Okay, anybody want to comment on that verse? Anybody know what the Lord is talking about when he tells Rebecca about the 2 nations in her womb?
He's just letting her know son was gonna be, the older son was gonna be serving under the younger son.
Okay, even though Rebecca did not understand the commotion that was going on inside of her body, she certainly wasn't aware that she was going to be the mother of multi-nations. You know, how many mothers think of their kids as being the fathers of different nations? In those days, it was kind of unusual, but for God to tell a woman this before they're even born is definitely supernatural. We all agree to that. So in answering her question, she was kind of like Daniel when he asked God how long would they be in captivity, and God gave him much more in the answer. God gave her much more in her answer. Not only did he tell her that there were twins struggling with each other, but they would be the father of nations, and these nations would also struggle with each other. And of course, one would serve the other. Any other comments or questions on that verse? The two nations that God spoke of in regard to Esau was the Edomites. And I'm sure if we remember some of our Bible stories as Jesus traveled up and down, as the children of Israel came out of Egypt, all of these nations, as Joshua led the conquest of Canaan, all of these nations came into place somewhere at some time. And then, of course, Isaac, or at that time his name was Jacob, he became the father of the nation of Israel. Of course, before this happened, Jacob's name was changed to Israel. And then, of course, he became the father of that nation of people. So the two nations that God is telling Rebecca about right now, one is the Edomites, named after Esau. The other, of course, was after Jacob, the Israelites. Let's put verses 25 and 24 and 25 together, somebody.
When her days to give birth were completed, behold, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red, all his body like a hairy cloak. So they called his name Esau.
Okay, those two verses, 24 and 25, was telling us about the actual birth, and took us to the exit, I guess we can say, of the first child, of the firstborn, which was Esau. And in that verse, his name is descriptive of his looks, or his looks is descriptive of his name. We don't know, well, I guess his looks came first, and then that's why they named him Esau.
Right.
Now, these were kind of twins, but they were not identical twins, right?
Right.
Because they were conceived and born at the same time. So far, we've only talked about one of the twins, and that was Esau, the firstborn. And his description was I don't know how a mother would feel if she looked up and saw a very hairy baby. But the description here says he was hairy and rough. Now, to see a newborn baby looking like that, first thing comes to our mind might be a different life form. You know, how many things that are born these days that are hairy? We don't think of us as being born hairy, do we? But he was hairy, the hairs were evidently red, and whatever rough means, you know, for a newborn baby. Any comments on that, those two verses, 24 and 25? We've only talked about Esau so far. Okay, then let's pick up the second brother in verse 26, somebody.
And after that came his brother Adam, and his hands took hold on Esau's heel, and his name was called Jacob. And Isaac was 80 years old when she buried him.
Okay, now we have the birth of both sons. As our subject calls them, the siblings rivalry. The rivalry began in their mother's womb, but it didn't end there, did it? Matter of fact, we could almost say it hasn't ended to this day when we look at their descendants. But at this time, first son Esau was born, and he was hairy and rough. The second came out probably looking more like a normal human baby, but for some reason he was holding on to the firstborn's ankle, heel, or foot. And that has something to do with his name also. Any comments on that?
Well, the name was called, Heel Grabber,
Mm-hmm. Supplanter?
and then I think it was like they were he was already trying to, because they had been warned with each other inside the womb. And it's almost like Esau came out first, and almost like he's still hanging on to him, still warring with him. And, you know, I don't know if he's trying to pull him back in or what.
That's what I was thinking. It was almost as if Jacob was saying, no, 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 I should be first. Not you, I should be first. So his hand holding onto his ankle is sort of symbolic of trying to hold his brother back, you know, for whatever reason. But that's what you think when you think about that. And the comment says the fact that Jacob grabbed Esau's heel verified from the birth that what the Lord had told Rebekah was true. The name Jacob means holder of the heel, or supplanter, or deceiver. And as time went by, didn't Jacob prove to be all three of those?
Mm-hmm.
Born holding the heel, or supplanter. And later on in our lesson today, he's going to show his first step in deception. So the name Jacob described him. The name Esau described the firstborn. Jacob would deprive Esau of benefits of being the firstborn son, symbolic of holding that heel. And then it tells us that Isaac was now 60 years old when his twins were born. Anybody want to figure out how old Abraham must have been at this time? Isaac is now 60. How old is Abraham? Anybody want to guess?
160.
100.
At least 160, huh? At least 160. Okay. Verses 27, someone?
The boys grew up, and Esau becomes a skillful hunter, a man of the open country, while Jacob was content to stay at home among the tents.
Don't that sound something like one was a daddy's boy and one was a mama's boy? Yeah, that's kind of sound a little bit theme of that.
Yeah.
One was physically and active, you know, getting out and doing what we would call a man's thing.
Yeah.
And the other one was kind of stay around close to mom, you know. Today we would say he might be in the kitchen or wherever mom hang out, you know, just kind of be with mom. So we find that not only was their birth, you know, kind of controversial or in contrast, but as they grew up, they continued to be different also. And since Esau spent much time outdoors and Jacob stayed at home, Jacob had an inside benefit as a result of staying at home, staying closer to his parents. Because this allowed Jacob to learn more of the ways of the Lord than Esau did. So Jacob was more familiar with what the Lord had intended through his grandfather Abraham and what possibly his role could be in that covenant. All these things was being internalized in Jacob because of his environment at home. Meanwhile, Esau is out there doing what his father loved, bringing home the meat. So as these two boys grew up, we find that one became more and more fit to be the extension of the covenant that God made with Abraham. The other one, even though he was the firstborn and should have been the one to do this, he was drifting further and further away in the opposite direction. And what encouraged this was their parents. And I'm not saying that was directed from the Lord. I don't necessarily think it was, but you know, they are descendants of Adam, both of them. They are human beings. And so they're fleshly motivated just like we are today. Isaac loved what his oldest son did. He loved the food, the wild flesh or whatever Esau was capturing or killing and bringing home. And when time came for the blessing, as a matter of fact, Isaac is going to send Esau out, especially for that purpose, so he can have this favorite, good tasting meal before he passes out the blessing. Meanwhile, as we have said, Jacob was at home learning the ways of the Lord from his parents and familiarizing with the covenant made with Abraham. Any comments on the lesson up to this point? Because we're about to take sort of a different turn from here. So if we want to close this thought out, we can say now we've gone through an additional generation and taken a step forward toward the fulfillment of the covenant. Just to reflect back for a second, it began with Abraham, back in the 12th chapter of Genesis, when God told him he would be the father of many nations. And there he was, well into his years, and his wife was barren. But here comes Isaac. And now Isaac is to be the extension of that covenant. So we can say Isaac was step 2. And then today, Isaac has twin sons, and we could call them step 3. Now let's take a look, if there's no questions or comments on what we've covered so far. Let's take a look at what happened as these sons became men. And that would take us to, what, verse 28? Okay, verse 28, someone.
And Isaac loved Esau because he did eat of his venison, but Rebekah loved Jacob.
Okay, add verse 29 to that for me, too, brother.
And Jacob saw it parted, and Esau came from the field, and he was faint.
Okay, we find that Isaac was encouraged, we find that Esau was encouraged by his father Isaac, because Isaac had a taste for wild game. So if your father, if you're the son, especially the oldest son, and your father really is pleased with what you do, then chances are your father's going to encourage you, and there's going to be a relationship between that oldest son and that father, which is a good thing even today. But in the case of Esau, going out, being a great hunter, and bringing home what they say it was a wild taste that Isaac loved, Esau was encouraged to do something that was okay, but it was in contrast with God's promise, with God's covenant with Abraham. But at the same time, you can see that Esau was being encouraged by his father.
Why was it in contradictory?
Well, maybe contrast is an extreme. Maybe I shouldn't have said contrast. But the emphasis for Esau was not to learn the ways of God, not to be more familiar with the covenant that God had made with his grandfather, because he was loving the outdoors, being away from his parents. Where the other kid was closer to his parents, where he could hear and learn the ways of God from them. You remember both the mother and the father had turned to God in the early parts of the lesson. So they both were people of God. They were familiar and believers. So if you're around someone, just like that's why we come to church, to be around other people who believe in God so we can be strengthened by sharing the belief. So the kid that was closer to two God-fearing parents was closer to understanding than the one who was famous for being away and outside.
But wasn't he taught by his dad?
Isaac?
Yes.
The lesson itself tells us that the emphasis for him was being out doing what he loved to do. And the emphasis for the other one was being around, close to home.
We're gonna cover that in the 31st verse.
Okay. So if Sister Magdalene, if you'll just let us hold that point, we'll come back to it. Okay, what verse did we leave off at?
We read the 29th.
Okay, we're at the 29th. Okay, now start. Huh?
We read 29th, we started 30.
Okay, so 29th and 30 and the rest of the lesson tells us about what happened, the relationship between these two brothers as they grew up. So since we read 29, let's read 30, getting ready to close out, 30, 31. Let's see if we can wrap it up. Okay, let's just go 30, 31, and 32 for now. Somebody, 30, 31, and 32.
And Esau said to Jacob, feed me, I pray thee, with that same red pottage, for I am faint. Therefore was his name called Edom. Therefore was his name called.
Okay, and 31,
And Jacob said, sell me this day thy birthright.
and 32.
And Esau said, behold, I am at the point to die, and what profit shall this birthright do to me?
Okay, now let's take a serious look at verse 31. When the son who was the outdoors type, who was rugged and strong, a good hunter, had come in from a day of hunting. And the Bible don't tells us whether he was successful that day or not. We don't know. But what it does tell us is that he came in very, very hungry, right?
Right.
Let me see, where does it say that at? Verse 32 says, look, I'm about to die.
29.
Okay, he was so hungry, he felt like he was just about getting ready to check out. And having spent much time knowing the Lord from Rebekah and Jacob and Isaac, Jacob knew far better than Esau did the value of the birthright and thought it was worth bargaining for. So from the home training, from the insight and information given to Jacob from two godly parents, his value on the birthright was much, much higher than the value of Esau. So what does Jacob say right here when Esau says, I am really, really hungry, give me some of your stew? What does Jacob say in verse 31?
Birthright.
Sell me your birthright. Now, if Esau had the same values that Jacob had, do you think Esau would have agreed to sell his birthright for a bowl of stew or whatever it was?
No.
So,
Well,
that's what I'm saying. So they both knew the story.
right.
They both knew, story from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Esau gave up his birthright. That's what I'm saying. It's going to be, you go cover the 31st verse. Knowing the historical value of what the birthright meant, he still gave it up. So that's the problem. He still gave it up because he gave it for some food. But one more thing that's not here that's significant. His mom knew the story too. So his mom kind of was behind Jacob as well, pushing for that because God already told her who was going to serve whom. But I'm still saying Esau still gave up his birthright, and that was a problem because he didn't have to. He could have just died, but he didn't have to give up his birthright. And that's where you're coming from.
So-
That birthright didn't mean as much to him
right.
as it meant to
Right.
Jacob.
And that's what I meant when I
No,
say,
but-
go ahead.
So you're saying because he gave it up, it didn't mean as much to him, but he was getting ready to die, and it says he couldn't do anything with it once he died.
You don't give up a birthright for anything.
But what does your birthright mean if you're dead?
So you still don't give up a birthright. If I give you an example, right now you have over in England, Queen Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth's parents were not on the line of succession. Her uncle advocated the kingship to get married. He gave up that line and it went to his brother, and we're still talking about that, almost 50, 60 years later. So by giving up that royal line, that birthright to that royalty, it changed, it switched family. I mean, it's the same family, but switched brothers. So Queen Elizabeth's cousins would probably be king or queen, but that dad gave up that right over marrying another woman.
I understand that, but still,
Yeah.
If I'm dying, I'm gonna be dead. I'm not worried.
But your
about what
kids,
goes
that's
on,
what I'm saying.
But I'm not worried about what goes on.
But your
behind me.
kids,
But if it means for me to live and die,
I'm
I
still
have to
saying,
give up something.
I'm still saying this.
And while I'm alive, I can take care of my kids, but when I'm dead, I can't.
So I'm still saying this. If you are let me just say this. D. If you are Esau, who's your daddy?
Yeah.
No, that's his brother.
I mean,
Isaac is a.
So, was there a point in time where Isaac was gonna die?
Oh, yeah.
When Abraham took him up?
Right.
But Isaac and Abraham knew what God had promised. So Abraham was gonna kill his son, knowing that the son was gonna be the promise. So he had faith in God. That God is gonna deliver him or whatever was gonna happen. Esau didn't have that same kind of faith. He had his birthright, but he didn't have that same kind of faith. He gave it up. That's the difference. I mean, he's thinking he may be dying. No different from Isaac when he's on that up there and daddy getting ready to kill him. That was real. But they depended on God. The faith in God did something else for them. He lost his faith a little bit right there because over being hungry, tired.
Side of this story, because it was the tradition of the Jew that the firstborn son, okay, at the death of his father, not only automatically had the birthright from birth, but would receive a blessing with the birthright, which would entitle him to 2/3 of his father's inheritance. The firstborn would get 2/3. Let's say the father had $100. The firstborn would get $66, and the second one would get 33. Now that was the physical, the earthly side of it.
And one more point, Dale, and I know Carla. Go ahead, Carla.
Well, and then Jacob got him pregnant, born with him even in the womb. He came out, like you said, kind of like wanting this from the beginning. So because your brother about to die, you keep saying he knew the covenant, he knew this, he set up under his daddy, but you mean to tell me, he wouldn't even feed him. He still had to give him something.
But still, support. I was gonna go back to Devon, Carla. So Devon, your brother got food. You not agreeing to give the. You don't have to agree to give your birthright. You just take the food. You don't have to sit there and die. I mean, because he had people under him as well. He could have gotten food not only from his brother but anybody. He actually didn't value that birthright, is what we're saying. Like the brother, but the brother was taught by the mom. That's your right. Even though, because there was some trickery going on. That's your right, though. Even though your brother is the firstborn, it's your right because God told me. But he didn't have to give his birthright for the food.
So because he was told that, because he was told it was his birthright by his mother, do you believe that he felt like he was doing the right thing by denying
No,
his brother
I'm
food?
saying he didn't have the same significant value of the birthright that Jacob did.
But what I'm saying is that because he believed that,
No, I'm saying Jacob was led by his mama
and that's what I'm
to
saying.
do the trickery.
That's what I'm saying.
Oh,
So-
I'm saying
so
Jacob
he
knew
felt
what
like
he doing.
It was okay for him to deny his brother in order to get what he
Jacob
believed.
knew what he was doing, but we're also saying Esau still gave up the right that he didn't have to.
Another word we could use is faith. We could easily say that
Yeah,
Jacob's
5 minutes.
faith in God was there and strong as compared to
Yes, sir.
little or no faith from Esau. And if anybody else in the world and outside the world knew the heart of Esau, God did. And even though it was the Jewish tradition for him being the firstborn to take charge, God knew his heart. Somewhere in the Old Testament, one of the prophets say, God didn't like Esau even before he was born, because he knew his heart. One of the prophets said that. Now let me give you an example for today that would be a test of our faith. Our pastor is in Kansas. Minister McDaniel is going to bring the message, okay? All of us, plus other people, are going to be listening to Minister McDaniel deliver the message. Now this is just an example. Suppose the Oklahoma Police Department walked in that door while Minister McDaniel was preaching and shot him. And then looked around at all of us and say, we're coming back next Sunday, don't you be here. How many of us would be here next Sunday? Huh? We're talking about faith. We're talking about a belief in God that's so strong that it overpowers the flesh. That's what we're talking about. And God knew Esau's heart from day one. And if you follow the story, the biblical story of Esau, you'll find that he did exactly the opposite of what Abraham wanted their sons to do. He married not one, but 2 Canaanite women, and went on to create a race that was in contrast with the nation of Israel. Our time is up for this lesson. It would be nice if we could continue this and discuss it more, because the more you discuss God's word, especially when you have opposing point of views, it benefits all of us because we learn more. Because nobody knows everything about God's word, and you can always learn some more.
Amen.
But since the clock on the wall says, that's all, y'all, we're gonna stop right here and turn it back into the hands of the superintendent. And I wanna say thanks to everybody who was out this morning, especially thanks to all those who contributed to help me bring the lesson. Thank you.
All right.
I want to thank Deacon Evans for, lesson for the adult class. At this time, we're going to have a report from the beginners and primary class. Babies, come forward.
Can we get the scripture for next week too? I get it.
Amen.
Miss Riley, you want to come up? Okay, and Ofan is gonna do it for us. Now, he did really well down there. Somebody help him out. Church of Living God Ministry. Everybody say it. Church of Living God Ministry. Report of beginners and primary class. Say that much. Report, beginners, pupils present. Who's here today? 4, okay. Teacher, who's your teacher? Okay, you told me, who's your regular teacher? Y'all told me who your teacher was. Who's your teacher?
Miss Johnson and Miss Butler.
Okay, Sister Butler and Sister Morgan, is that right? Okay, and who's the acting teacher today? I know it's you. You are. What's my name? Sister Battle, okay. Our offering today was $20. And who is the pastor?
Uncle Kenny.
Oh, okay, Uncle Kenny.
You're the preacher, I'm telling you.
Yeah,
You got it
okay, good
right.
job, babies, thank you.
He got it right.
Okay. I don't think there was a junior class this morning, so, what class do you teach?
Intermediate.
Intermediate? Okay.
Junior, intermediate.
All right. I had a mixed class. I don't know what class I tried.
That's okay.
We have 4 kids in the class and $6.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Who's the pastor?
Uncle Kenny. Okay, you ready, Secretary? Okay, at this time, we'll hear a report from the secretary.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Today's date is November the 4th, 2018. Sunday school opened at 10 a.m. with song and prayer. The mission statement was recited in unison. The classes were dismissed to their teachers. Today's lesson, sibling rivalry. Genesis 25:19-34. Report of classes. Beginners and primaries class. Acting teacher Deaconess Tabitha Battle. Pupils present 4. Offering $20. The juniors and intermediates class. Teacher by Sister Pam Robinson. Pupils present 4. Offering $6. The adult class. Teacher Deacon Homer Evans. Pupil present. Okay. Sorry about that. Offering $222. The breakfast this morning was $32.81, making our total of $215.19 once the breakfast was taken out of that. Superintendent, Deaconess Patricia Pickett, Acting Superintendent Deaconess Tabitha Battle, Secretary Deaconess Norma McDaniel, and Pastor Elder Kenneth Morgan.
Okay, you've heard the report from the secretary. Are there necessary corrections? Okay, if not, the report stands approved as read. Do we have any,
Next week.
oh, yeah, thank you.
Tell them to read the 26 as well.
Okay, our lesson for next week, which is November the 11th, that's Veterans Day. It's Jacob's deception and is found at Genesis, the 27th chapter, 5 through 10th verse, 18, 19, 21 through 29. But Minister Tracy said, read the 26th chapter of Genesis. So start with the 26th chapter of Genesis and then just read the 27th chapter and then you'll be good to go. Okay, do we have any announcements?
There's 41 present total.
Okay, 41 present? Yes, yes.
Excuse my seat. After morning services, if you ordered one of the new books for the book study, we'll have them out in the vestibule there after morning service.
How much are they?
$12. The book is called Unshakable Hope, Max Lucado. Excellent book, y'all. Also, we know that, like I said, next Sunday is Veterans Day, actual Veterans Day, November the 11th. On the 17th of November, that is when we give out our Thanksgiving baskets. I don't see Sandra, Minister Johnson, maybe some of the other ministers can tell us when the items are supposed to be.
We'll make the announcement at church.
Okay. We know that there are Thanksgiving baskets from 9 to 12 on the 17th of November, so you know you're gonna have to have everything in before then. Also, on the 18th of November, there's two things going on. The citywide ushers are having their annual Usher Day program at Followers of Christ at 3 o'clock, but our pastor is preaching at the Church of the Living God, PG&T, at 3 o'clock. And I'm sure he is wanting not only the choir to go, but the membership to meet him over there. That's on the third Sunday, which is November the 18th. Okay, items are supposed to be turned in on November the 14th.
Unless it's a perishable item, and he said if it's something that's perishable, you bring it the day of the baskets, that Saturday
And you should know
morning.
who you are on those perishables.
Got applications for the best.
Deborah had them last week. I don't know who has them this week. Sister Minister Deborah Williams was taking them last week. And I don't know when the deadline is on that either, so we don't, maybe Minister Tracy can tell us more about that.
We'll make it now. We'll make it now.
Okay,
We'll send it.
so they said they'll make an announcement, we just have to listen for it during morning service. Okay, any sick and shut in?
Yeah, we want to keep Sister Perry in our prayers, who passed away,
Sister who?
Sister Ann Perry.
Oh, okay.
And we also want to keep her in traveling grace too, because she'll be traveling home to.
Mississippi.
Okay, and then, I wanna keep, Jay and his classmates, the class of 95, in prayer. They lost one of their classmates, on Halloween. He was the same age as Jay, same birthday, January 26, 77, and they're gonna be funeralizing him. His name is Dante Patterson, and they're gonna be funeralizing him on Tuesday, at Allen Chapel at 11 o'clock. So I wanna pray for all those babies at Northeast, because it's rough when you have a classmate that has gone on so soon because he had a heart attack on Halloween. So
Another thing, guys, who's Stafford? I still don't know what group I'm with, and I still don't know what I'm supposed to bring.
okay, I'll get that.
That's right, too.
I'll make sure that I'll tell you in a few minutes when we go out, when we dismiss. We're running over time. Anyone else? Sick and shut-ins. We don't want to leave anybody out. I don't hold this, but you hear them every week. So
Amen.
okay, let's stand. Let's have prayer. And get ready for morning service. Definitely want to pray for the pastor and his family as they're celebrating Brother Smith, Deacon Smith's 80th birthday today, y'all. That's a blessing.
Amen.
80 years old today. That's awesome. Okay. Let's pray. Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, in earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, oh, it's just gonna walk.
Hey Dale, do you have the money?
Yeah, what do you need?
I need to give,
That's what you need to pay back for.
I need to give, out of the, yes,
No, do I have change for it? No, ma'am. But I can give it to you. By the time you get there, I can take it
Kathy's not gonna be here today, and I don't know what she's supposed to be doing, what her part was in the communion. How you doing, Sister McDaniel?
fine, you?
You am? You know what she's supposed to be folding or something, I don't know.